Okay, so today I'm going to go over how to do some basic applique techniques, and I'm going to start off making a heart shape just because it's one that we're familiar with making if you've watched my other videos. And you can start off by creating this square and then your 20 by 20 square, and then snap the ellipse tool to make a 20 by 20 ellipse as well. And then you can place these next to and on top of your square, and you can go to path and union. So now that we have our heart shape, you want to click on it again, and then holding down your control key, rotate it, and it'll snap to 15 degrees and you can put it upright. So from here, I'm going to kind of make this larger. So you can again hold down your control key to maintain the ratio. And there we have our basic heart shape that we're going to use to create an applique. So the first thing I like to do is come up here to my node tool and select my shape and see if I have any duplicate points. I know with this heart shape I tend to have a duplicate point right there. So I'm going to Command Z and I'm going to delete that shape. I'm going to go ahead and make that you can use this auto smooth node tool. I'm going to check this one. That one just has one point as well. Okay, so from here I want to kind of drag this point in just a little bit, and I'm going to re-round that part. And then I like to delete these 2 points here. Just kind of pull this in a little bit. Okay, so I'm happy with that shape. So next we'll add the outline to create our appliques. So for an applique, I'm going to want to duplicate this shape probably 4 times. So I'm going to hit Command D, Command D, Command D, and now I have 4 copies of my shape. The first shape, I'm going to add a layer, and then I'm going to right click on that first shape that it still thinks is a rectangle, and I'm going to call this heart so. And that way, if I decide I want to cut this shape using a craft cutter, I can have this raw SVG shape, and I'm gonna actually drag it up to the second layer and drop it in the second layer. And then for this second layer, I'm gonna go to Extensions, Inkstitch, Commands, Add Layer Commands. You can see there's only one layer command, which is Ignore Layer. Do not stitch any objects in this layer, and hit Apply. And it'll take a second to think, but it'll update my layer to say this layer will not be sewn. So now as we go through and we check our params, so there it added this little icon to show that it's not going to sew that layer. And you can see in our layer, if you do the drop down, there is this command in there. And I'm not sure that this is actually in there. There we go. So make sure your heart is, I'm gonna bump that one up, and make sure your heart is underneath this Inkstitch no sew. Okay, so now we want to just make sure that we lock we can lock and hide that cut layer, and we can rename that. This is our cut file layer. Okay. So now we can begin working with these other heart shapes that we have on here, and we can start by, with our selector tool, selecting all of them. Left click on the X to get rid of the fill, because these are now just going to be an outline. And that's the other reason why I like to keep this invisible, because sometimes I want to see what the background color looks like, especially if I have multiple shapes that I'm doing applique. And I want to know, I want to keep up with what color is the shape that's behind my stitching. So I'm going to go ahead and start with this first stitch layer, and I'm going to hide these other two and just work on that. And I'm going to make it red by shift left clicking on the red. Now that's going to be a running stitch, and that's going to be my placement stitch. So I can rename that placement stitch. So it's going to just do a running stitch in red, and that's going to let me know I need to put fabric to cover that spot, or I can, have my shape cut out with a digital cutter, and I know I need to iron it down right in that spot. So that's my placement stitch. For my next layer, I'm going to make that green, so I'm going to shift click on this lime green color, and I want to do a little bit of an inset, because if you are cutting out your shape, you want your tack down to be a little bit on the inside so that it holds down the fabric. It's going to be able to grab all of your fabric, especially if you've already cut it out. So I usually come to path, and I like to do dynamic offset, because you get this little button here, and you can access that by going to your node tool, and then you can just kind of drag down and figure out how far. It's kind of snapping right now, so let me turn off my snapping tool. I just want it to be, a little bit on the inside. And then you can go path, object to path, and now it's just a regular path. And we'll name that tack down. And then my final path is going to be my satin stitch. And I'm going to select that stitch, which is black right now, and I'll just make it purple. And I'm going to make it 3 millimeters so that it definitely covers all of those other stitches. And I'm just going to select it, and I'm going to go to extension, Inkstitch, satin, convert line to satin, and there we have our satin stitching. One of the parameters, if you're stitching on a t-shirt, that I really recommend is to, let's rename that satin. I'm going to Command Shift P, and that is 3 millimeters, and I will show you some examples of me sewing just 3 millimeters, and then I tried doing an underlay, a zigzag underlay here on t-shirt material, and neither of those worked. In fact, the zigzag made it worse. And the problem is that it's just really tiny, So even though it was set to 3 millimeters, it actually stitched out and looked like it was 1 millimeter. In order to fix that, I want to change the pull compensation. And you can see that it says millimeter each side, and that is separated by a space. So you can either do percentage. So let's say you want to do 50% on each side. If so, that's going to make it 1.5 millimeters longer on each side. I don't actually want that. I actually did some research and found that for t-shirt we want about 0.4 millimeters on each side. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that regardless of what your stitches are. If you just want a 2 millimeter line or you have a 4 millimeter line, you still need to add 0.4 millimeters to each side. So specifically for t-shirt material. So I'm just gonna stick with that number because that worked really well for me. And I'm gonna hit apply and quit. And that is essentially how we set up our file. And now I can even turn that back on, and you can see that. And I can take this entire layer and put it underneath so that you can see what it looks like. Command Shift period to see your stitch plan preview. And there you can see that it just stitched out the line. And you can't see the stitches underneath because you need to do the actual simulator, and I'll show you what that looks like whenever I stitched it up. So to prepare your applique fabric, make sure you iron on some heat and bond. That's going to make your applique much more durable to wash. And then my secret for doing t-shirt applique is to put this Fabri-Solv water soluble stabilizer actually on the front of my shirt that I'm going to be stitching on. And that creates a barrier that when you're cutting, prevents you from cutting the t-shirt. And additionally, you can mark your center point. You can even print your design and place it exactly where you want it to be. So here you can see I stitched the skate first because that's more likely to give me problems. But then I hooped the shirt for the heart. And there is my placement stitch. I put my fabric down and then I cut it out. And you can see that that was a pretty simple shape to cut out, so it went pretty quickly, as well as having the inset tack down stitch gave me a little leeway. Okay, so the next thing I was going to do was show you a more complex applique, and I was going to stitch out my previous word that I had done with satin stitching. That was the word skate. However, it is very difficult to do that fine detail work on a 4x4 inch hoop. And so I just wanted to show you another option for making designs that are a little bit larger, even if you only have a 4x4 embroidery machine. So when I first started doing machine embroidery, I had a machine very similar to this one, and it was a refurbished Brother machine, and it came with very basic materials here. So all I had was this one 4x4 hoop, and I very quickly knew that I would like more space if I could get it, if there was any way I could get it. And I learned about these hoop extenders that you can get, and you can see here that it has these little connectors that are on just a regular 4x4 hoop, and you can pick it up and move it, and it's nice because you just have to have one hooping but there is a little bit of an area of an overlap. And you can see that this is 6 3/4 inches or 170 millimeters wide. And so there's a overlap in between. And I actually did create this exact same file using this hoop when I first started. And it just requires a little bit more patience, and you have to kind of do it in segments. So I'll go over how to set up a hoop so it works like this. Or if you have a machine that does 5x7, that's also plenty of room to do this next project. So we're going to go ahead and start off with our 100 by 100 millimeter hoop size here. And I'm going to make it larger if you want to use one of the extension hoops or if you have a larger hoop. So go ahead and go to File, Document Properties. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and change the width to 170 millimeters if you're using the extension hoop. And if you're not using the extension hoop, you can just use a larger hoop. Okay, so we're going to add a couple of guidelines here. You can do that by clicking on your ruler and dragging out. And you want to set one at 100. And then you can see this is 170, so we need to come to the 70 about right there. And then you can just try to create part of your design in this 4x4 area and part of your design in this 4x4 area. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and come over here to our text tool on the left side, and we're going to just click anywhere on our canvas, and we're going to type our word that we want to create. And then we want to come to text, text and font, and that'll open this dialog box. And from here you can change your font. So I'm just going to search on the font that I want. And I'm also going to change the size. Let me hit apply. And from there, I'm going to kind of place my lettering in the top left, maybe leaving ½ centimeter. That looks good. And then I'm gonna go ahead and drag this out, holding down my control key. And that looks pretty good. And then I'm gonna go ahead and break these letters up. So I'm gonna go to text, text to glyphs. Now at this point, all of these letters are still text objects, so I could change this S to another letter if I wanted to. However, we just did that, so we can separate the S and the K. So I'm going to shift click on the S, and then I can kind of move this down and move this into this hoop. And I'm going to go ahead and go to Path, Union for these, and just create one object from those. And I may need to make that a little smaller, just so it will fit in this 4x4 area. And then I can kind of move this S over. I can make it larger if I want, but... And then in order to be able to create satin stitching around it, I need to turn that into an object as well. So I'm going to go to Path, Object to Path. Then you can see we have our nodes around there, and we can no longer edit that text. I now want to select both of my objects. I 2 here on my layer panel. And I'm going to go ahead and shift left click on my line green and left click on the X here so that I have an outline with no fill. I'm now going to create my 3 copies of this like I did before. So I'm going to go Command D, 1, 2, 3. And at this point, if you were doing these separately, you would want to put all of your S objects in one layer and all of your Kate objects in another layer, and work on them separately as 2 separate stitch files. But I'm going to proceed working on these together because I am going to ultimately stitch this out on one 5x7 hoop. So in order to do that, I'm going to go ahead and hide all of my objects here, except for my bottom 2, which are the S and the Kate. And I'm going to select those 2, and I'm going to Command G to group them. And this one is probably the most simple because I'm just going to write the word placement on that group, and that is my placement stitch. So again, you would have to have a placement stitch for your S and a placement stitch for your Kate if you were doing these on 2 separate smaller hoops. But just to see what that looks like, I'm going to go ahead and Command Shift P to go to my params. And I'm going to look at my jump stitches specifically. And you can see that there are jump stitches to these inner parts of our lettering. So we want to go ahead and select both of those objects, and we want to Command Shift K to break everything apart. And then we want to select everything again, so we have everything. Then we want to go to Extensions, Inkstitch, Stroke, Auto Route Running Stitch. And we're not going to select anything, we're just going to hit Apply. And then we're going to hit Close. And now when we click on that and Command Shift P, you can see that it still has a little jump stitch here, but it minimized the jump stitches to be on the inside, which is good because we're going to cover this up with fabric anyway. So you can cancel that. And that's our placement stitch. I'm going to go ahead and then select my next 2. I'm going to hide that placement stitch. Select my next 2 and turn that little eyeball on. And I'm going to shift left click on the red to turn those red. And while these are still sort of all combined, I want to go, I'll do the Kate first because I can't do them together. Or go to Path and go to Dynamic Offset. And then it comes up with this little diamond shape here. If I turn my green layer back on, you can then see that you can pull this in just a tiny little bit. And there you go. That will be your tack down stitch for the Kate part of the word. And then we'll do that on the S as well. So I'm going to go Path, Dynamic Offset, and I'm going to pull that red part in. And then I'm going to select, let's go ahead and lock our placement, and we'll select the red S and Kate, and we'll go ahead and go to path, object to path. Then we're going to go ahead and Command Shift K to break those apart. Select them all, and then we're going to go Extension, Inkstitch, Stroke, Auto Route Running Stitch. Hit Apply, and then we should have a folder called Auto Route, and we can rename that Tack Down. And you can see under placement, there is also a folder called Auto Route, but we had created already our folder called Placement. So you can do it either way. You can put that inside, or you can wait to change the name until after you've created the Auto Route folder. But I'm gonna go ahead and select the Tack Down, Command Shift P, so we can see what that looks like. And similarly, we have just a tiny little jump stitch here and little jump stitches inside. And that's what we want. Most of this is going to be covered up with our satin stitch, which is going to come out a little ways. So we don't need to worry too much about it. But I like my tack down stitch to be a little bit, maybe like 1 millimeter inside, maybe 2. So that it really grabs the fabric and holds it down. So we can lock that tack down layer, and then we're going to go with our next 2. We're going to turn our next 2 on, and we're going to go ahead and with those 2 selected, we're going to make it the final color that we want our stitching to be. So I'm going to go with this light purple. So I'm going to shift left click on the light purple, and then I'm going to change my stroke, and normally I would just come here, but I need to change it to 2.5, and I'll show you why. So you want to go to your fill and stroke menu, which is right here, and if you can't see it, you can go to Object, Fill and Stroke, and then you want to go to your stroke style, and here you can change your width to whatever you want it to be. So I'm going to go 2.5 millimeter, and if you, that still looks pretty good, but when I move up to 3, I have tested this and the stitching is a little too thick, and you can still read the word, but it is difficult to read. So it's kind of up to you if you want to do this thicker stitching, but it is not going to stitch out that much. It's gonna look much thinner. So what I prefer to do is do the 2.5, and then you want to, with those 2 selected, you can group them and name this your satin stitches. And then with those selected, you want to Command Shift K again and select all of them. Go to Extensions, Inkstitch, Satin, Convert Line to Satin. Okay, so then we're going to manage our actual satin stitch. We're going to go to Inkstitch, Params, and you actually want to add a little bit of pull compensation, because this is, we're stitching on t-shirt material here, and t-shirt material tends to bunch up under the stitching. So adding, I have learned through research on the internet that you want about 0.4 millimeter, regardless of how wide your stitch is. So even if it's 3 millimeter, if you actually wanted to stitch out at 3 millimeter, you need to add 0.4. millimeter to each side. And the way that you add to both sides is that you want to do 0.4 and then do a space and do 0.4. And that information can be found on the Inkstitch help site, but that's how you enter it. Or you can do a percentage on each side, but I'm not sure exactly what percentage it would be. I just know 0.4 for t-shirt material. And then we're going to look at our jump stitch and trim stitch. And you can see that there's these jump stitches here that go across. And if you come here and trim after at this point, it will get rid of all those trims. I found that doing the trim at the auto routing stage still left some jump stitches that I would have to go in and manually trim later. So now it's actually going to trim everything, and you're going to get a better final stitch out. So you want to hit apply and quit there. The last thing we want to do is this last version of our word skate. So I'm going to select both of those, and I'm going to actually fill it with whatever color I want my fabric, base fabric to be. And I can shift left click. I don't want any type of outline around it. This is just to mimic our fabric inside there. And what I'm going to do with those is I'm going to create a new layer, and I'm going to select those two paths that are my fabric bird, and I'm going to right click and I'm going to go move to layer, and I'm going to move those to layer 2, the one we just created. And for that layer 2, I'm going to go extension, Inkstitch, commands, add layer commands. You can see there's only one layer command that you can add, and it is to ignore the layer. And that's what we want to do. We don't want this to stitch out. We want it to be ignored. It's just there to see what our back fabric looks like. If you want to try different colors, you can do it that way. So I'm going to hit apply on that. You can see it added this little marker here, and within layer 2 it says ignore this layer. And the last thing I want to do is move that layer down below our first layer. So then we want to click off of everything and go ahead and Command Shift L so we can see what it looks like in our simulator. And it looks like we have good coverage over our placement and tack down stitch. We don't have any horrible jumps. We have this one here that is from our red layers, and I think there's a green layer under there too. So you can go in and add a trim, but just know your machine is going to jump every single time it has to go in between these letters. I'm going to go ahead and accept that, and I'm going to now do my realistic preview, Command Shift period. There we go. We have our stitch out right over our fabric color. And if I want to select layer 2, select my paths, and let's say I wanted to try a different color under there, like gray, I can do that as well. And I'm actually going to be doing this on a black t-shirt, so let me do my purple, and I'm going to actually change my document properties and change my page to be black. And that's how you can see what it'll look like on the background. So I'm going to go ahead and export that. I'm just going to put it right on my desktop. So let's go ahead and see what this looks like when I stitch it out. So here you can see my first hooping. If I had to do over, I would probably float it on a sticky stabilizer. I did end up putting a back sticky stabilizer, You can see here it stitched out my placement, and then I put my fabric and it tacked it down. And this is sped up quite a bit. It did take me, according to my recording, it was about 12 minutes for me to cut this out. Just take your time, you know, put some headphones on and kind of enjoy the process of doing this. And the stabilizer really helps to protect the t-shirt, and I'll show you some examples where I cut through the t-shirt just trying to remove my applique fabric. It's very difficult to do without the special applique scissors and with that water-soluble stabilizer acting as a barrier between your scissors and the t-shirt. So that's kind of my secret method of doing it, and it really made the process just a lot easier. Okay, so that's what it looks like stitched out. To finish it off, you might want to cut these off, but I was kind of trying to tear it off of there. But you want to remove as much of the water-soluble stabilizer as you can get off of there, but also without pulling the fabric too much and possibly tearing the fabric. I stopped it there. And you can see that I also had some stabilizer there that was just tear away. And then I washed it and ironed it. And you can see the close-up of the stitching. It's really pulling on that fabric, and that's why you want the iron on, so that when you iron it, it sticks and you don't have bulking up around there. And then I applied this tender touch to the inside so I couldn't feel the stitches on the inside, and that's pretty much how you finish it off. And you can keep your scraps of your heat bonded fabric and use them in other projects. Promised. These are some of my mistakes that I made trying to do this lettering applique. This was the first one that I stitched out, and I did not put any of the water solvi on top. I only put the tearaway stabilizer on the back of it, and you can see as I was trimming, it started to, you know, tear and cut through. Part of that was it was difficult to get my scissors in there and cut the fabric away without hitting and kind of poking holes in the t-shirt material. And the other problem was that I have too much stitching here, and I did not add any pull compensation, which was really pulling at the t-shirt, and it also was much smaller and more dense. And when you have a lot of dense stitching, it's essentially cutting the fabric, it's perforating the fabric. I tried putting the tearaway stabilizer on the front, and as I was tearing it away, it also kind of was messing up the fabric. But you can also see that my stitching did not cover my fabric. I was able to trim it without cutting through, but you can see here it pulled away so much that you can see my tack down stitch, which I originally tried to do as a zigzag, but I do not recommend doing it as a zigzag. It's too dense and it just creates more stitching and makes the fabric more easy to tear when the stitching is that dense. So also you can see that that is not really 2.5 millimeters. It's maybe 2 millimeters, more like 1.5 millimeters. So on this one you can see I did not put any of the iron on my applique fabric, and that's what happens. It kind of bunches up because it's stretchy and it kind of pulls on the thread and the stitching, and I did not add pull compensation to this yet, so it still was not stitching out wide enough. And then for this one, I basically finally got my stitching wide enough, but I stitched the collar onto it. But I wanted to show you that I used matching bobbin thread, and I think that that really helps to make the stitching, you know, colors pop out a little better and they look a little brighter.